Now it is my tremendous pleasure to introduce you to Glen Hiemstra. Glen is the founder of Futurist.com and an internationally respected expert on future trends, long-range planning, and creating the preferred future. Glen has advised many professional and governmental organizations for over 2 decades. A speaker as well as a consultant to many Fortune 500 companies, and an author of a number of books, including Millennial City and How a New Generation Can Save the Future. Glen is no stranger to Cox. In fact, he has worked very closely with Cox Communications on a number of instances, and we are just thrilled to have you back with us today, Glen. Thank you. Today, Glen will share with us his views on the development of telepresence, media, 3D communications, automotive trends, green business opportunities, and a whole lot more. So without further ado, please give me a round of applause as we welcome Glen to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. So it's very nice to be here. I don't know how many of you are in the room are from Cox Communications. I know Brian has been in a program with me at least once, and so it was really great to see him, and it's wonderful to be back here. The answer to the first question is 6'7", and the answer to the second question is yes, I did, but it was when the shorts were very short and all the players were very skinny. And the answer to the third question is no, you don't have to be tall to see into the future. That was the T-shirt that when I was a college professor, which I was when I was a kid. That's the T-shirt they gave me when I left that and went off to do this work as a professional futurist as the 90s began. So now for more than 2 decades, I've had a chance to work with enterprises across many kinds of industries as well as the sort of nonprofit and government sectors in strategic and long-range planning, as well as making presentations, as we will do this morning. Each organization that has called me, particularly I would say in the last 15 years, essentially calls with the same request, and the request is this. We routinely do strategic planning in our organization. We have some methodology and we have some calendar timing for that, but this year we'd like to look further into the future than we usually do. Typically that's more than a decade, sometimes it's as much as 20 or 30 years into the future, and that's a very powerful thing to do, and the reason it's powerful is that if you look further ahead than you normally do, the world kind of frees up, the world of choices and possibilities. If you're developing a plan for next year, your choices are fairly constrained. You really are stuck with essentially coming up with a way to get a little bit better on the things that you already do, rather than developing completely new things. If you look 5 years ahead, or even 10 or 15 years ahead, the further out, the more choiceful the world becomes. So that's the first lesson. We're going to come back to that over and over again. One of the things that I also discovered as I've looked at the future now for this couple of decades is that essentially what you do when you're looking further ahead than you normally do is you're trying to learn a lesson from the future, as though the future has some things to teach us if we pay attention to it. And what it teaches us might be something that we should be paying more attention to, like consumer connectedness. It was a wonderful presentation that we just heard. It was really clever, but also really quite powerful in illustrating the degree to which the connected world has in fact become our lives. It's not a feature of our lives. It is our life. And you don't really get it until you look at that. And one of the lessons is the future is telling us things we should pay attention to, things that we should get ready for, but perhaps also telling us things that we should let go of and start thinking about letting become part of our past rather than holding on to them too tightly. And we'll see a little bit of that. Now, as I flew yesterday, I was reading, as I typically do when I'm on the plane, and something popped up that caused me to change or add my presentation and add this slide to what I had already sent ahead. I don't know that this news will shake the market, although it immediately caused a several dollar rise in the stock price of the Tesla automobile company. Yesterday, Adam Jonas from Morgan Stanley released a report on behalf of Morgan Stanley in which he put up this chart that you see on the left. The vertical axis on the bottom are a human-driven automobile. On the top is an autonomous automobile. On the left is the asset is owned by individuals, and on the right, the asset is shared by individuals. So in the lower left quadrant, you get today's world, which he says is a 100-year-old model, in which individuals own the asset called an automobile, and we pretty much drive them for ourselves. In fact, as we all know, that's the world that we exist in. Now, those of you who are from the Cox Automotive, I'm going to make you nervous, because it's a pretty powerful statement that he put out. So on the right side, on the lower part, is the shared economy. And everybody's familiar now with the shared economy. It's one of the primary economic trends. And, of course, I will later put up a little picture of Uber and a little picture of Airbnb and so on, as the world figures out how to take assets that are owned by individuals and then enable those individuals to share their assets in ways that we couldn't before because of the connected consumer world. It's just been made possible just really in the last 3 or 4 years, and it's a pretty dramatic change. We're all hearing about the prospect of driverless cars, or certainly automotive technology that enables the cars to assist us as a driver, to take over perhaps when we're on a freeway, or perhaps when we're on certain kinds of roads that have the right kinds of sensors and so on. So high-tech but individually operated automobiles that are largely or completely autonomous. What Adam Jonas says is where we're really headed, though, is to the quadrant in the upper right, a world of shared autonomy, in which there are autonomous vehicles not owned by individuals driving us around, a shared vehicle owned by some entity. It might be Uber, it might be Apple, it might be Google, it might be the Ford Motor Company, it might be the municipal transit agency that owns a fleet of autonomous vehicles that are available to take you wherever you need to go. And he believes that's where we're headed. Now, the point of this article and the reason that he wrote this report was that it was a report focused on Tesla. And what he suggests in the article, in the report, is that he expects within the next 18 months, Tesla is going to make an announcement of a strategic plan to move in that direction, of not just producing cars, the first fully electric car, the first fully connected car. It's the first car that's capable of being upgraded on the fly. That is, they send us software upgrades overnight, and now suddenly you have more autonomous driving capability than you did yesterday, just simply because of a software upgrade that downloaded overnight. We all are familiar with this happening. And he suggests that within 18 months they're going to release a plan that they're going to take us toward the shared economy with autonomous vehicles. And so he writes, as we have written at Morgan Stanley for some time, we expect all car companies would eventually see nearly 100% of their revenue shift from the sale of human-driven, individually owned cars to robot-driven, shared cars. 2 weeks ago, I was in San Francisco for the World Future Society meeting. This is a professional association that anybody can join, and they have an annual meeting every other year at some city outside of Washington, D.C., and every other meeting in Washington, D.C., where they're headquartered. The keynoter, whose name I don't recall, is the head of a hedge fund in the San Francisco area, big investor in the Google driverless car system. And I would say he emphasized nothing more than he emphasized his belief that we're moving toward the world of the upper right in this quadrant faster than we think. Now, the question is, how fast is fast? I had a chance in my life as a futurist to be around Bill Gates a couple of times, being from Seattle, where I'm from. And one of the things that Gates is actually quite famous for saying is that he learned, or he believes he learned as the head of Microsoft, that when it comes to understanding the future of technology, we tend to overestimate how quickly technological developments will be put into place. We hear about them, and we think, oh, that's going to be true tomorrow. And then it's 10 years later, and it's never really quite here. At the same time, he said we tend to underestimate the degree to which that technological development, when it is in place, will change our lives. So, for example, at Microsoft, they underestimated how much the internet would change the whole world of computing. And in fact, of course, his regime was famous for having not quite gotten that right, because they thought that it would take a little bit longer, given his first principle, but they also underestimated how much it would change. How do we judge whether or not a technological development is in fact going to become real? Well, I use a sort of 3 filter criteria. I don't have a slide for this in this particular program, but it's easy to remember. A technological development we hear about, like what we see here, shared autonomous vehicles, is likely to become real when it meets these 3 criteria. Number 1, is it technologically feasible? And that is increasingly becoming technologically feasible, but it's not feasible yet. It is possible to have an autonomous truck. I spent some time this spring with the trucking industry, and there are experimental autonomous trucks. In fact, the first ones have been licensed in Nevada, and they're driving on the freeways in Nevada. It requires a driver behind the wheel, but the driver can let go of the wheel, and the truck steers itself down the road very, very effectively. And they call it sort of the driver's freedom initiative. And it's a very cool thing. So that's technically feasible, but to have an entire network of automobiles that are working in that way, as in fact we saw a little hint of on the screen in the previous presentation, we're a long ways from that. Technologically it's feasible, but there's a lot of technological installation to do before we're there. That's number 1. Number 2, is it economically viable? Is it economically attractive? Is it cheaper than the other alternative? Right now, it's still cheaper for individuals to get behind a car, and it does add somewhere around $10,000 to $30,000 to make a car autonomous. It's not as much as you think, actually. The current estimate is about $30,000, and the expectation is it might raise the cost of an automobile about $10,000, and that cost will, of course, go down to make it fully autonomous. Well, that's going to be trivial as you go forward, but it's not quite there yet. The question is, how soon will it be? So technologically feasible, economically viable. And then the third one is the critical one. Is it socially and politically acceptable? Now, socially really means, will the consumers buy it? Will the consumers embrace it? Do they want this? Surveys are kind of mixed on this. So a lot of us say, yes, if my car could drive itself, I would really want it to do that. I'd love to be able to take my hands off the steering wheel, take my hands off the gas pedal and the brake, and spend time being productive, for example. The younger the survey respondents, the more it skews in that direction. Young people tend to believe that driving is one of the biggest time sucks in the world. And they'd much rather be connected with their friends or doing work or being productive in some way. Politically, regulatorily, will this become acceptable? And of course, that's a battle that's going on. But on an experimental basis, Texas and Nevada and California, a number of states have made it possible to test autonomous cars. And I expect that will become acceptable on the regulatory basis actually much more quickly than we think. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. That caught my eye yesterday. I could not put that into the program. The only question, I think, is when. Are we talking a 5-year horizon, a 10-year horizon, a 25-year horizon? And I don't really quite know the answer to that. I did hear at the TED conference this year, the head of the Google driverless car program, and I'll show you a little video of their latest, some of their latest video here in just a moment, answer the question of when do we expect fully autonomous automobiles to be accepted regulatory and in the consumer space and out there on the highways. And he said, my answer is this. My son is 7 years old, and I don't expect him to need a driver's license. So that gives you a clue of how optimistic they are. So that would be a fairly quick transition. I think he's probably off by a factor of another 7 years. But are we talking about the end of the 2020s? You know, so we're talking maybe a 15-year transition. I don't know. We'll come back to that. You might have some questions about that. So here's what all of that says to me, particularly if you're here in Cox Automotive. As I mentioned, I've been around a lot of organizations that have done strategic and long-range planning on this longer-range horizon than they typically do. And one of the lessons that I've learned from that is most planning becomes a search to create a more efficient past in the organization rather than a search for a truly new future. That's partly because organizations with human beings in them are sort of inherently conservative organizations, even when we're trying to be creative and very ahead of the curve. People are afraid of being seen as crazy. Risk is risky. And so while we might have a lot of creative ideas that say we could be doing something radically different 5 years from now or 10 years from now, as groups make decisions, those more radical visions tend to get ratcheted down into a search for a more efficient past rather than a really new future. So how do you break free from that cycle? If you say it would be good for us, whether we're on the communication side or in one of the other enterprises or on the automobile side here, automotive services business, how could we break free and really search for a truly new future? It's not easy. What happens when you stay in your lane too long? Well, you end up on the cover of Fortune magazine. And this is my favorite cover ever of Fortune. It's actually quite ancient now. In fact, it's 20 plus years old, that cover. You notice 3 dinosaur shapes on the cover. Their names are Sears, IBM, and General Motors. And in this particular article, in that particular year, the authors were asking, have these 3 companies named by Peter Drucker 30 years before as the best managed companies in the history of the world, now literally dinosaurs in danger of going extinct? And what had happened to each of them is they each had an image of the future, of retailing or the automobile business or of computing, and they focused on business strategies that would keep them successful in the future that they were focused on. Meanwhile, the world of computing or of automobiles or of retailing was going somewhere else. This was in the early 1990s. And it was going somewhere else either before they noticed in those companies, or much more likely, and everybody knows this is true, before they took seriously what they were noticing. That is, this room and all companies are full of people saying, hey, wait a minute, the future's going over here. And then the people mostly in charge say, well, that might be true, but I'm retired in 3 or 4 years. So you guys worry about that later. And that is literally an issue. I also saw something yesterday as I was coming out related to the picture I'm about to show you that said, and it's another sort of long-range planning consultant who said, I'm consistently in front of organizations talking about what the world is going to be like 18 or 20 years from now. And what you discover is that almost everybody in the room expects themselves to not to be here in 18 or 20 years. And so while that's interesting, doesn't seem that relevant to them. And that's a real challenge to how do you guide a company when what you're talking about may outlive your own tenure here. Now, each of these 3 companies worked very hard since the early 90s not to go extinct. IBM has been clearly the most successful. They went through almost a complete metamorphosis of the kind of company that they were. Remember, they were making PCs and selling PCs, and they sold that business. They went sort of back in some ways to the future of becoming much more of a business and computing services company again. General Motors probably would have gone extinct had they not been rescued by the federal government here in the last 5 years or so. And they're constantly faced with this. Now, I've read just in the last couple of weeks that General Motors is in a race now with Tesla to introduce the $35,000 fully electric car before Tesla does. Because Tesla keeps putting that off and putting that off. They're going to introduce their sort of SUV model this fall, we are told. But the 35,000 model has now been put off to maybe as late as 2017 or even later. And General Motors, I hear, thinks they can beat Tesla to that marketplace. And if they do, that could be a very important thing for them. Sears, well, I talked to somebody who's on the board of Sears not long ago, and they said, boy, I wish you could go work with Sears. Because Sears just kind of keeps going. But in the early 90s, what was happening when Sears was on the cover of Fortune magazine? Well, a guy named Jeff Bezos was saying, what if I could create a catalog in which people could buy everything? In other words, what if I could recreate Sears? How did Sears miss that? I mean, it's unbelievable when you think about how Sears missed that. Companies miss these things all the time, partly because they don't see them, but partly because they're afraid of losing the business that they have now, with the classic phrase of cannibalizing. Who's this guy? And what is he holding? This is the guy, and again, you can look up his name, and I'm not good at remembering names. I don't remember, although I just looked at it again this morning. What he has in his right hand is the first ever digital camera built by Kodak in 1975. And he was the guy who invented it. And it was a camera unit attached to a little television unit. The camera captured an image. It recorded on a videotape, which is on the right side, just below his chin there, to the right side of his chin. That's literally a videotape. And it could record a video image onto that videotape and then play it on a television screen. And it took about 60 seconds to record an image, and then I think I have that right, and about 8 seconds for it to gradually come up on a television screen. So he showed it to everybody in Kodak. And what did Kodak do? They literally instructed him to hide it from everybody else in the company. Because they said, we can see that that is potentially the future of photography, but if it becomes the future, we're dead. Because it will cannibalize and destroy our film business. And so they hid it. Now, many, many, many years later, Kodak tried to keep up, or tried to catch up and introduce the video camera, or their own digital cameras, but it was far too late. And Kodak went from a company that employed 108,000 people there up in the Northeast until they went bankrupt, and now there's a little remnant of them. They employ about 8,000 people. And it's a classic story of they had the idea, they could see the future, but because they were so afraid of destroying the business that they have now, they literally hid it. They didn't just not act on it, they literally hid it. What happens when you stay in your lane for too long? So how do you avoid that? Well, you have to think in the future tense. You have to think in new ways by asking, what is your image of the future? And literally what I mean by that is, when you think of the future, what kind of pictures and images come to mind? And there are 3 more specific questions that you can unpack that with. Number 1 is, what is probable? What are the things that are likely to happen in the next 5 to 10 to 20 years that are going to impact the business that you're in? Second one is, what is possible? This one I really like from an organizational perspective. Ask it in this way. What is outside the boundaries of the way we've usually defined our business, that if we gave ourselves permission to dabble in that area, maybe to do some research in that area, maybe to do a pilot in that area, we might discover some new potential for ourselves? Not just what is probable that we should be getting ready for, but what is possible that if we experimented with it, we might discover some new things for ourselves. And out of those 2 questions, you have a much better chance of coming up with your answer to the third and most important question, which is, what is preferred? It's really the vision question. What is the vision for our organization in the future? What is our preferred future? Given what is probable and given what is possible, particularly if we think outside the boundaries, what is our preferred future? And I think this is a really interesting one. And I've been around the Cox Communications people several times here in the last 3 or 4 years, I think, maybe 4 years consecutively with the Executive Development Program. And I actually think that question has gotten more complicated just in these 4 years than it was 4 years ago. Because the array of possibilities, think of the possibility question, the array of possibilities just seems to grow. On the automotive side, now the world has seemed pretty stable for a long time. You're working with a 100-year-plus old model for how the whole automobile system works. But I think we might be on the cusp now of that rate of change, perhaps not matching the communications world, but beginning to move in that direction rather than just plodding along. And just think, well, yeah, but people aren't going to like it. Well, yeah, but it's never really going to be technically feasible. But yeah, it's always going to be too expensive. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's not. And I'll keep going on that. So one of the things we like to say to each other, and we love this phrase, is, well, the future's unpredictable. Who knows what's going to happen in the future? Yeah, there's connected consumers, and yeah, there's Google's experimenting with their self-driving cars and so on, but it's really a mystery. It's unpredictable. Nobody really knows what's going to happen. It is true that the future is never perfectly predictable. Something will happen in the next 5 years that will surprise me and everybody in the room. That's just the way the world works. Somebody's going to invent something. Probably what's going to happen is that a couple of smart kids are in some room right now in Silicon Valley with a big whiteboard, and they're writing down automobile auctions on there, and they're asking, how can we disintermediate that business? I don't know. Or they're writing down smart homes, or they're writing down whatever it is. And as a matter of fact, they are. They're writing down every kind of business that you can think of that's been around for a long time, and they're saying, how can we disrupt that business? And we don't know how that's going to turn out. So from that standpoint, it is kind of mysterious. But there are lots of things about the future which are not mysterious at all, and are relatively knowable, is the way I like to say it. Not predictable, but knowable. None of the things on this list will surprise you. An aging, diverse customer base. Connected consumers, as we've just heard, but also connected producers. Consumers becoming producers and using your systems in that way. Income gap economics, which is, I think, still the dominant aspect of the future of the economy for the next few years, if not the next couple of decades. Everything becoming intelligent and mostly cheaper. A new economy focused on optimizing underutilized resources. That one sounds like a word salad, but it actually could be the most important of all the trends that I have there, because it comes back to my original slide. And finally, the last thing I'll do is challenge you again to think in new ways. Let's talk about aging diverse customers. It's a chart that I've shown to every audience for some time. It's from the Census Bureau. And it says that by 2025, 10 years from now, in the United States, we will have 27 Floridas. Which means that 20% or more of the population in the shaded states will be over the age of 65. It's always fascinating to fly and to watch how many older people, particularly in the summer when the tourist season is at its peak, how many older people there are. I flew home from England sometime this year. It was in May. I had a program in Italy, and we flew through Heathrow coming home. When we got off the flight in Seattle, I would say there were about 30 wheelchairs lined up in the jetway waiting for people to get off the plane. And I thought, and it's a big airplane. Admittedly, it's a very big airplane. And there were lots of older people. Although I have read that stewardesses call that there is this thing called the miracle recovery on flights, in that a whole lot of people are on wheelchairs getting onto flights, and then it turns out they don't need them when they get off the flights, and they use the wheelchairs to get through security more easily. And so the stewardesses call that the miracle recovery. 27 Floridas. What does that mean? I use this too. I used to talk a lot about the millennial generation. In this room, we have probably quite a few members of the millennial generation born after the year 1980. We have to remember that the millennial generation is actually pretty old 10 years from now, too. They're literally getting to be about 45 years old, the leading edge of them. And so they are not the kids anymore. They're the people in charge, by and large. Older, but not necessarily not technological savvy. We'll come back to that. The second thing about this, where we're headed demographically, is living in cities. And this relates, again, both to automobiles and connectedness. This is a chart of the global population that shows that sometime between 2005 and 2010, we crossed this line from throughout all of human history, a majority of people living in rural areas and a minority living in cities, to now a majority living in cities. And the UN expects by 2050, some 70 to 80% of the world population will live gathered together in cities, or what are really large metro areas, exactly like we have here, for example, in the Atlanta area. Think about the transportation implications, but think about the connectedness implications as well. That's where customers are going to be. They're going to have different needs because of that. They're going to be driven by the sustainability imperative. I pay a lot of attention to this. I know one of the things that you're interested in is smart homes and more efficient homes, but again, it comes back to the transportation world as well. This is a wonderful little video that plays silently of the melt-out of the Arctic ice every summer. And if you're really interested in the future of the environment and the concept of climate change or global warming, you can actually go every day to the Snow and Ice Data Center online. Speak about a knowledgeable consumer. It's a federal government program. They're based in Boulder, Colorado. And they're the ones that keep track of these satellite images of how much ice is left in the Arctic and the Antarctic, how much snow there is in the world on any given day. In the summer, the ice melts. It reaches its lowest level usually about mid-September every year, because the sun is up 24 hours a day, and it's above freezing in the Arctic usually during the summer. It's been far above freezing this year in the summer. In fact, it's been quite hot up there in the temperatures in the 80s and 90s frequently in the Arctic. And in 2012, we reached the least amount of ice left in the Arctic since they've been paying attention to this, which admittedly is only since 1979. And you'll see how little ice there was left in the Arctic at that time. That's why Russia is building naval bases along the northern Russian coast, and why the Japanese are building large icebreakers to take advantage of that shipping route. It reduces shipping time from Japan to Europe by 2 weeks if you go through the Arctic. And of course, this is why energy companies are interested in there. And there's a certain kind of irony in the fact that we might go up and harvest oil from and natural gas from the Arctic so that we can heat up the atmosphere even faster. But I don't know that we'll be able to prevent ourselves from doing that. This year, the meltout is tracking right along 2012. 2012 was the minimum ice ever measured, and this year, being a very warm year up in the Arctic again, it's tracking right with it. We'll see where it ends up in September. Why does that matter? It matters because of the words at the top screen, the sustainability imperative. This kind of knowledge is just becoming generally known in the population, both to people who are in companies but to general consumers. And so there is a gradual day-by-day increase in interest in sustainable products, sustainable practices, sustainable transportation, and so on. And you may or may not be politically wedded to a particular point of view around this thing called climate change, but it hardly matters whether you are or not. From a business perspective, the world is just gradually becoming more and more focused on, are you delivering a more sustainable product in a more sustainable way than you did yesterday, in a way that's also affordable? If you are, you're a winner in the marketplace. What else will we see demographically? The 2020 census will show that 50% of people under the age of 30 in the United States are minorities. Are 50% of the people in this room minorities? Not quite. Not quite, but 50% of potential customers and potential employees won't just be older, but 50% of them will be from groups that we label as minorities, starting in 2020, and then, of course, the numbers actually skew more and more in that direction as we go out to the year 2043 or so, when a majority of the entire population of the United States will be from groups, historically, that we have labeled as minority groups. And so the whole customer base changes in that way, but in particular, the potential employee base changes in that way. We are more connected, as we've heard, and I don't need to belabor this much because we had such a good presentation on it. But I like this illustration. It wasn't that many years ago you just didn't see this. You saw some people holding up cameras, but any public event looks like this now. Most of these are probably just taking pictures. A few of them might actually be live streaming the event, and there are, of course, increasing numbers of applications that enable all of us to produce our own live stream video right into the web and become our own, in a sense, producers of news as well as consumers of these events. As recently as 2005, worldwide, only 33 out of 100 people had a smartphone. As of most recently, it's about 93 people out of 100, and we're soon to cross over that so that there are more than 100 smartphones per 100 people in the world, so that we have literally become what I like to label phono sapiens. We've moved from being Homo sapiens to phono sapiens. And what that really means is, when I was young, the internet and the connected world began. And some of you are in the room are probably too young to remember these days, but some of you remember them. And we used to frequently say something like, can you hold that thought for a minute while I go online? And we had this concept of there was the offline world, there was real life, and then there was the online world. And every now and then we would interrupt our real life to go online in order to find something out or to do something. I don't know that it's true yet of the youngest person in the room, but it will probably be true of our children, and certainly of every kid being born about now, is the concept of online, offline is just gone. There isn't online life and online life, offline and online. There's just life. These things have so thoroughly merged as we've become photosapiens. That's how connected we are. It's, if we're checking our phones, Brian, did you say 6 times a minute? 10 times an hour. 10 times an hour, which actually sounds too low to me. I'm sure that I'm much more than that. And they've simply merged. This is a chart of the unconnected shrinking. What's fun about this one is not so much that there's a very small percentage who have no connection to the internet or no smartphone as we get out to 2017 of the global adult population, but to go back to 1995, the beginning of this chart. In 1995, 100% of the global population had no internet and no smartphone, essentially. So it's just a 20-year revolution. It's pretty mind-boggling to think that that happened in 20 years and then to time shift it ahead 10 years to 20 years again, make everybody 100% connected, make everybody connected to the internet with smart devices that we wear, carry, and perhaps even have implanted in some cases. And you see how connected we're likely to get. If we could get to the next one. What that means is when you have nearly 100% of the global population connected to smart devices and constant information, you begin to generate more innovation, more inventions, and it becomes a self-feeding process. A self-feeding process that is leading to a phenomenon that caught my eye last week in Seattle. Does anybody recognize this picture? This was actually a press photograph that was all over the news last week, or maybe it was the week before. This is Key Arena in the city of Seattle, where the long-lamented Seattle Supersonics used to play professional basketball. There's about 12,000 people in there who are in there for 12 hours a day for 4 days, watching the Dota 2 video game team tournament. Now, this weekend I watched the PGA Golf Championship, and I kind of like to watch it because I really like the kid who won. I don't know if any of you paid any attention to this kid from Australia named Jason Day, 27 years old. And he's been trying to win a major golf championship for many years, and he finally did. And so he walked away with a check for how much money? $1.6 million. A very sizable prize for a lifetime of devotion to learning how to play golf and finally winning the PGA championship. This is the Dota 2 championship in Seattle 2 weeks ago. The winning team, who competed for 4 days, competed for 4 days in order to become the winning team, to 12,000, and I'm not talking 12,000 quietly watching, but 12,000 madly screaming fans, not to mention millions of people around the world watching live on the internet. The winning team walked away with how much prize money? $6.6 million. The total prize for the tournament was $16 million, dwarfing the PGA Golf Championship. It's a phenomenon that I'm not a part of it. I barely know that it exists. Are any of you a part of this world? The sort of online video gaming world?
I was there.
You were there?
Yep.
Seriously? Yeah. And was it fairly raucous from time to time?
It was amazing.
It was amazing. This is the front page of Twitch. I just screenshot this last week. As you can go on to Twitch, one of the primary online networks, where you can watch online constant gameplay going on, and there's basically a sports commentator talking about what's happening. This is a game being played live by a number of different people, and then of course a lot of advertising wrapped around it. And Twitch is now being rivaled by YouTube, and YouTube is trying to come at this. Google and iTunes are trying to come up with their own networks. But here's some numbers that are just quite shocking in the New York Times. Last year, I tried, and somebody in the room who knows this market research and ways to get at that I don't, could give us the current numbers. But as of this writing in July of 2014, so a year ago, Twitch had in April through July of 2014 had occasionally surpassed not just headline news, not just CNN, not just MSNBC, but had more viewers than MTV or True TV on a daily basis. Probably almost none of us here even know that it exists, even though we're in the cable business, sort of. And this is quite stunning. And it's hugely growing. It's rapidly growing. There's a huge marketplace. It's it's primarily young males, and there's that whole controversy going on about women in the gaming world, and that's a really significant issue. But it's primarily young males aged probably 16 to 26 or so. And if you think about the potential global aspect of this and the amount of traffic that this is going to drive to what we think of as our communication networks, and we're talking not gigabytes and zettabytes and whatever's beyond zettabytes, this is where that traffic is especially going to come from, because, of course, it's so data heavy to do, not just to play the games, but then for everybody to watch them live as they're being played. This is, of course, who is growing up with the technology, as we all know, leading us to become people of the screen who don't accept old limitations. We think of kids as people of the screen, but of course now it's baby boomers entering retirement who are also people of the screen. And people of the screen just don't accept old limitations, and all of your businesses have been impacted by this in terms of we want more choices, we want more control. We expect to, for example, be able to buy differently than we ever bought things before, and we saw some numbers on that. We want to be able to look for things. We want to be able to get advice on how we're going to buy. We want to shop broadly. We want to be able to automatically order, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. People of the screen are simply not going to accept old limitations. In the future, people might view things differently. 20 years ago, I was on the board of directors of a startup virtual reality company. It turns out we were about 20 years too early, which is why that particular company went bankrupt. But going back to my Bill Gates thing, we tend to overestimate how fast things are going to happen, but underestimate how much they might change things. This is the advertising video from Microsoft's HoloLens of what they expect viewing of entertainment, whether it's games or television or work-related activity, might be like in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years. I think that this is probably, it may turn out to be a little bit like 3D television and not really picked up by that many consumers, but it might also be a bigger deal as we shop for various kinds of things like vehicles. You can start out, you can be an entry-level VR consumer with this $10 cardboard virtual reality goggle set from Google. It's got 2 glass lenses. You put your smartphone inside of it, and it can be turned into essentially a 3D viewer. But of course, where we're really headed is to almost all video entertainment captured with cameras like you see here. This one put together by GoPro and Google. And there are some very professional now cameras being put together. In fact, it's expected that most television and other kinds of entertainment recording will be done on 360-degree cameras going forward, so that all entertainment that is recorded will be capable of being broadcast as a 3D, fully immersive kind of thing going into the future. Perhaps we'll be wearing, for connectivity, some kind of augmented reality contact lens in the relatively near future. These things exist and, of course, are being experimented with, but the experiment that caught my eye the most is this one. This was done 2 summers ago at the University of Washington, being able to connect brain waves to activity and gameplay. The person on the left is watching a video game on a screen and thinking about, it's a first-person shooter game, and he's thinking about pulling the trigger using his index finger. But he doesn't actually move his index finger. He just thinks about doing it. The guy on the right has his trigger finger on the keyboard. Whenever the guy on the left thinks about shoot, the guy on the right does not see the game. He just sits there with his finger on the keyboard. Whenever the guy on the left thinks shoot, the guy on the right, who is on the other side of the campus, his trigger finger twitches. So they are sending mental signals using brain waves across the campus using today's internet to do that. The guy on the left thinks shoot, the guy on the right shoots. It's both scary and intriguing if you think about the future of connectivity. Economically, this has created a global knowledge value economy where it's what a product or a service or a person knows that really counts. What it means is your ability to put knowledge into whatever you're doing is the most important thing that you can do. The income or the economy is also driven by income gap economics. This is a famous chart. It's been out for a little while since the Economic Policy Institute put it out. What it shows is the disconnect between productivity and wages in the U.S. If you ask, can consumers afford whatever it is that we're providing to them going into the future, it becomes more and more of a question. Because from 1948 until 1973, productivity went up and wages went up at the same rate. Starting in the early 1970s, productivity continued to go up, not quite so fast, but wages began to split off. And if you think about all the conversation we have, both in the economic and political sphere, about income gaps in this country, this is the primary explanation. For some reason, and there's lots of reasons why we did this and how we did this, we separated wage growth from productivity growth. The amount of productivity and therefore the amount of economic value that is produced continues to go up, but it doesn't necessarily get reflected in wages. That means we have some economic challenges to overcome. I mentioned that everything becomes intelligent, and it does. Over the next 20 years, PCs will be replaced by millions of tiny intelligent systems embedded in clothes, jewelry, cars, furniture, and walls. We all know this. They'll recognize voice commands, carry out simple wishes. They'll cost less than a penny, less than a scrap of paper. So companies that don't put chips or intelligence into all their products will be at a severe disadvantage. Michio Kaku wrote that, but he wrote that in 1998. So he's really talking about the era that we're just entering now. He's talking about the year 2018. We're probably not quite there. These sensors exist, 50 billion of them we've heard in the interconnected Internet of Tomorrow. Driven by these kinds of technologies, and we're familiar with all of them, 3D connectivity, but nanotechnology and information technology and robots and space technology, leading us to, as we heard in the early presentation, the Internet of Everything. What is the Internet of Everything? Here's a good definition. A platform for devices to communicate with the world around them and to integrate the human, the natural, and the built worlds. What happens as you do that? Well, you get smart beds that are measuring how well you sleep and adjusting themselves until they're providing you with the optimum sleep on their own. You get smart medical devices that are tracking devices that you carry around or wear on your back. You get smart pill bottles that are communicating to the pharmacy and to the doctor and to you as well, whether you're keeping up with your medicines. You get accelerometers that can go in children's or kids' football helmets that are measuring the degree of a blow they're getting. So if a high school kid gets a blow to the helmet and it's hard enough to give them a concussion and the kid's saying, no, I'm fine, the coach can say, well, my iPad says you're not. Get out of the game. You get that kind of thing. But you also get this potential from a company called
What time is it in Tokyo?
It is 10:53 a.m. the next day in Tokyo.
What time is it in Tokyo when it's 2 p.m. in San Francisco, California?
It is 6 a.m. the next day in Tokyo when it is 2 p.m. in San Francisco, California.
When is the sun going to rise 2 days before Christmas of 2021 in Tokyo, Japan?
Sunrise in Tokyo, Japan will be at 6:47 a.m. on Thursday, December 23rd, 2021.
How many days are there between the day after tomorrow and 3 days before the second Thursday of November of 2022?
There are 2,714 days between the day after tomorrow and Monday, November 7th, 2022.
What is the population and capital of Japan?
The population of Japan is 127,288,000 and its capital is Tokyo.
What is the population of capital of Japan?
The population of Tokyo is 8,336,599.
What is the population of capital of the country in which Space Needle is located?
The population of Washington, D.C. is 601,723.
What is the population and capital for Japan and China and their areas in square miles and square kilometers? And also tell me how many people live in India and what is the area code for Germany, France, and Italy?
The population is 127,288,000 for Japan and 1,330,044,000 for China, and the capital is Tokyo for Japan and Beijing for China. The area is 145,882 square miles and 377,834 square kilometers for Japan and 3,705,386 square miles and 9,596,959 square kilometers for China. The population of India is 1,173,108,018. The area code is 49 for Germany, 33 for France, and 39 for Italy.
What's the monthly payment on $1 million?
We'll stop there. So that's an app for Android, soon to be for iOS, but it's an app called Hound. I don't know if any of you Android users have Hound. They think they've discovered a better algorithm for writing essentially a kind of artificial intelligence that's much better than Siri. And I've tried those questions on Siri, and Siri has a really hard time with those questions. And Hound apparently does not. What's happening is that science fiction is arriving when you think of the interconnectedness of things. And self-driving car is probably the best example. What does a self-driving car see when it comes to an intersection? It literally sees 360 degrees for about 200 yards. And it literally sees about everything that can be seen, which no human being will ever be capable of doing. This is why it will become more and more attractive. It will become so attractive that I think that more consumers will want this than anybody in this room imagines if it becomes economically viable and if it becomes regulatorily acceptable. Look at the number at the top, 34,000 U.S. road fatalities a year, 1.3 million a year globally. So far, in millions of miles driven, autonomous cars have not gotten into a single accident caused by the autonomous car, not one. They have been in about 12 accidents, always caused by human drivers running into them, or the human driver in the autonomous car taking over the car and then getting in a wreck. People say, well, the insurance companies are going to be they won't know how to insure this. But I believe the insurance companies are going to embrace this in a big way. And we'll come back to that again just a little bit. This is a large-scale disruption, potentially. Driving will go away. Industries will be challenged, including some in the room. Insurance will embrace it because the cars will not get into accidents. Municipalities may not embrace them because the cars will no longer get speeding tickets or red light tickets, which in many municipalities is a major part of the budget. Literally, that might be one of the reasons that municipalities will resist it regulatorily, because they'll have to rethink their budgets. When Delphi did a cross-country drive from LA to New York with their autonomous car, the number one complaint they had is the car never went above the speed limit the entire way. And so they were constantly getting yelled at, honked at, and flipped off by human drivers who were frustrated because this car would freaking only go the speed limit and was always in their way. Insurance will embrace it for that reason, and our lives will be changed. The only question is when. Will they be electric? Yes, they will be more and more electric. This is the gigafactory that Tesla is building in Nevada, which is going to produce enough batteries for 500,000 Tesla automobiles a year by 2020 or so, and they've fallen in price by 40% since 2010. The key trend that ties it all together is this one, is the optimization of underutilized resources, something that I mentioned at the very beginning. We're all familiar with Uber and its $50 billion market cap. We're familiar with Airbnb and its $20 billion Uber market cap. What have they done? They have taken underutilized resources, people's automobiles. How many hours a day does your car drive? Most people's cars drive on average an hour a day. And they sit about 23 hours a day collecting dust and evaporating a little bit of gasoline, generally speaking. That's an underutilized resource. It's a crazily underutilized resource. And so what Uber said, well, let's use that resource. Plus, a lot of people have some time on their hand. And they've turned it into a $50 billion business simply by building an app that takes advantage of the underutilized resources. Airbnb, the same thing. People have spare rooms, people have spare homes, and so on. What if they could rent those out? Now, there's a few problems with them, but my favorite quote is from the head of Airbnb when I believe it was Hyatt or Marriott made an announcement that in the next 5 years, we're going to add 30,000 hotel rooms worldwide. And the head of Airbnb said, we're going to do that in the next 2 weeks. What's the big deal? We'll add 30,000 rooms in 2 weeks. That's using an underutilized resource, leading us someday to the auto end game, where car transport becomes a service. My son-in-law, who works at Google, probably I'm going a little bit out of school, he works on the introduction of Android as the smart car system into the car companies, and they're having quite a lot of success with that. He was at our place last week, and I said, what do you think this means? He said, I think that means there'll be 60% fewer cars on the road eventually. The head of the hedge fund who gave the keynote at the World Future Society meeting 2 weeks ago in San Francisco said he believes that it eventually means there'll be 10 times fewer cars on the road than there are today. 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 25 years from now, that's the question. Individual ownership will increasingly become not the norm, but unusual. The only question is how soon. Technologically feasible, economically viable, socially, that is, consumerly accepted, and regulatorily possible. If you could wave a magic wand, this would happen in 5 years. We don't have magic wands. And I don't quite personally see how you get through the transition from 10% of the cars being autonomous and shared to 50% and 90% of us driving around, and then 50% of the cars being autonomous and shared, and 50% of the cars being driven by all of us everywhere, to a world in which you get 100% of there. I haven't figured out how that happens. I wrote a little blog on that. Maybe that transition is possible. Maybe it will always be too hard to really make happen. But I'd be trying to figure out month by month, year by year, what really is the likely timing, who's introducing it, who's in the game, and who's out of the game. How can we be a part of that game? Other things that might be using underutilized resources that are just worth noting, by the way, are this is a concept of a downtown urban farm done by a Seattle architect. This is a real urban farm. We can get the next slide to go, in Singapore, of a real urban skyscraper growing food downtown Singapore. And one of the expectations is that more and more unused big boxes, unused warehouses, unused and abandoned buildings will be turned into urban architecture as we use underutilized resources. And one other one is an underutilized resource is the sun. The sun will become the biggest fuel source for automobiles, for electric automobiles, as we use more and more electricity in automobiles. The price of solar is falling rapidly. And since solar is a manufactured product, next slide, because solar is basically a manufactured product, it'll get cheaper over time. Whereas extracted energy tends to not get so much cheaper over time, although it is at the current moment. So what does all add up to? I think it adds up to this. There's a slightly odd notion, says Alvin Toffler in 2000, in business today that things are moving so fast that strategy becomes an obsolete idea, that all you need is to be flexible or adaptable, or as the current vocabulary puts it, agile. This is a mistake. You cannot substitute agility for strategy. If you do not develop a strategy of your own, you become part of somebody else's strategy. You, in fact, become reactive to external circumstances. The absence of strategy is fine if you don't care where you're going. I'm sure that in these companies, you do care where you're going. So the question at the end of the day, once again, is what is your image of the future? What do you think is probable that you should be getting ready for? And what could you learn about that you don't know right now? What do you think is possible? That if you thought outside the boundaries of what we do or the way that we do it today, and gave yourselves permission to experiment with it or to play with it or to create a scenario for it, what would that thing be if you thought in terms of possibilities? And then out of all of that, what really would be your preferred future for your part of the business? What is it that you'd really like to create because it would be valuable to create it by 5 years from now or 10 years from now? What is your image of the future? In the end, the future is not something that just happens to us. The future is something that we do. And so the question, and I think the question for this whole day is, so what is it that we want to do? What is it that we want to do? That's the story. That's the lesson from the future. Thank you very much for your attention. If you want to get to me, it's easy to find me. And thank you. Time for questions. And I presume the questions are for both speakers. I don't know if that's true, or just for me. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. We're going to have a little bit of time for questions before we take a break. There are mic runners, and I think the mic runners are probably important for the purposes of the simulcast and the recording. So let's get a mic before you answer your question or get your question. So raise your hand if you have a question. A mic runner will come to you. There's one right next to you, right there.
Hi, I had a question about employment. What does this mean about to employment? Because obviously with fewer cars, with Uber and taking over, there's going to be less need for taxi drivers, truck drivers, and people manufacturing stuff. So what does that mean? Yes.
In certain categories, there will be a decline in employment. The trucking industry is very interested in this because their number one challenge is the shortage of truck drivers. It's a very hard job to be a cross-state, cross-country truck driver. It's physically demanding. You're away all the time, and so on. And so their biggest challenge is finding truck drivers. So they're very interested in the potential of autonomous trucks for some part of their business. Taxi drivers, of course, would be upset about this. It's said that you could replace all the taxis in New York. I think it is with something like 6,000 autonomous vehicles. And that would be very intriguing. But in the end, I'm about to write an article on how futurists are buying too much robot Kool-Aid. Because the futurist literature right now is full of warnings that robots are about to take over all of our jobs and nobody's going to have anything to do, and I think it is completely wrong. There will be job categories in which technology replaces the human beings, but the technology itself, through a connected global community, as I said, is leading to more and more inventions, more and more innovation, which tend to produce more and more jobs. In fact, I think you can make the case that our chief problem today is not that we are automating jobs too quickly, but that we are automating jobs too slowly. If you go back to that productivity chart, productivity was going up at a certain rate. It was actually going up at 96% between 1943 and 1973, or 48 and 73. Productivity growth since the early 1970s has actually been slower than before. Productivity is typically defined as the amount of human labor that is required to produce a good or a service. Since the early 1970s, it has actually taken more human labor to produce the goods and services that we have today rather than less, as compared to the decades earlier than that. We've actually becoming less productive. And so we'd actually be better off if we could automate more things and free up more people to get into more innovative jobs. I am not terribly concerned about it. I think that just as we don't know how many people are going to be producing and playing and broadcasting and commenting on Dota 2 games around the world in the year 2025, we just don't know what it's going to be. But I think it's an overblown concern. There will be fields in which jobs go away, but it's somewhat of a gradual process, and adjustments can be made, though they're never easy. What's another question?
Right here, sir.
Yes.
As we look at the future and we look at autonomous vehicles, domestically, what type of infrastructure changes do you see that will help enable it? And then as an add-on, do you see the adoption differently in different parts of the globe? We looked more domestic view, but in other parts of the world where there's not the same infrastructure, how is that a hindrance or a hurdle?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things. Number one, the sensing technology gets better, and so the infrastructure challenge becomes a little bit less over time. That is LiDAR and radar and the visual acuity of literally the lenses in the cars and so on becomes better and better. Plus the algorithms through the mapping of the world. I believe it's Google but maybe it's somebody else that's about to launch. Is launching. This is unbelievable. There's a company that is launching Android phones into space. Literally what they've done is they've taken an Android phone. This is an iPhone, of course, but they've taken an Android phone. They put some solar panels around it. So they create a satellite about this big. They can launch it into low Earth orbit. It'll stay in orbit for about a year before it falls out of orbit and burns up. And it turns out the camera is good enough to take very high-resolution pictures of the Earth. And so they are launching a fleet of these to be constantly circling the Earth north to south. And they're going to provide far more. They can literally take a picture of every part of the Earth about every hour, every day. And that and all it takes is an Android phone. It's very cheap. It's very cheap to launch. So the maps are going to get better and better and better. And that information then becomes available to the vehicles. And so you don't need as much. We used to think you'd have to have really perfect smart infrastructure with all kinds of sensors built into them and intelligence coming out of them, and that's less and less true. The Delphi cross-country driving experiment from, as I mentioned, from LA to San Francisco, they did say the number one problem was faded paint lines, that the car could really navigate well as long as the painted side stripes on the road were good. But when they were bad, the car had a little bit more trouble navigating. So it may be just that we just have to keep the roads painted. And of course, that can be a little bit of a challenge in other parts of the world. But it's going to rely mostly on mapping technology and then better and better sensing technology. I probably, when I look back, even at my own presentation just now, I probably overplayed the autonomous car thing a little bit. I think it's very exciting. I think it's very interesting. I think it's a long transition. I do remember watching that guy at TED this year from Google saying, my 7-year-old isn't going to need a driver's license. And I thought, So, if I'm on the auto side of the room in here, I would just be trying to pay attention, literally almost week by week, of what are we learning, and how soon are we going to see this, and what is it really going to mean? Because at some point it's going to be real. We just really don't know when. Another question.
Yes, this will be our last question.
With our connected economy, connected social environments, do you see digital currency taking shape, something more universal that replaces individual country currency kinds of economies?
There is a cadre of future prognosticators who definitely do, and they're much more versed in digital currencies. And I was at a MasterCard conference recently where they're very interested in that. But I still think that the primary digital currency will be a digital device connected to a traditional bank account, connected to traditional money as we think of it. And so the Bitcoins and so on of the world, I think for a long time, if not forever, will be niche players and have as kind of a special role to play. But it's very hard for me to come up with a scenario in which sort of national currencies disappear and some new digital currency invented by some smart kids in Palo Alto or wherever it might be replace that. I just don't believe that. And I also don't believe that cash goes away completely in any foreseeable real future. In science fiction futures, yeah, but I think that doesn't. But it does raise one thing that I think that wasn't mentioned. It wasn't one of the alphabet soup on the connected consumer, and S could be for security, particularly on the Internet of Everything right now. The emphasized aspect of the Internet of Everything is the security challenge. Now, you guys in the providing your networks and so on are very hip to the security challenge, but people putting sensors into toasters and into refrigerators and whatever it might be, much less so. And so the hacking community, as we've all been hearing now, just in probably the last 4 weeks in the news, are busy figuring out how you can hack cars and how you can hack refrigerators and how you can hack home security systems and how you can do all these things. And so I suspect there will be a massive industry surge in trying to figure out how can you make the Internet of Everything worthwhile as a connectedness thing, but keep it more secure. So I think that would be a big challenge. Thank you very much for having me. I know it's break time. Is there an announcement before the break we need to make? Break time. I'll be around during the break, and then I got to take off. Thank you very much. Thank you.